I'm Sheri Byrne-Haber. I'm here today to talk about doing user research with people with disabilities. Now you may be thinking, but wait, I just saw Joel and Pia's presentation. Do I have to sit through this one too? Well, Joel and Pia took it from the perspective of inclusion and civil rights. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you today about how to take it from a business perspective and also from a legal perspective. The first piece is to convince you that you want to do user research with people with disabilities. The second piece is how to sell it to the people who hold the budget and the purse strings to pay for it. And the third piece is to talk to you about what you need to change in your current research processes and procedures in order to make that more amenable to including people with disabilities in a productive manner. I want to make sure that you, at the end of this presentation, you're no longer intimidated by including people with disabilities, because you'll know what is different, how it's different, and how to do it confidently. In order to work with people with disabilities, software has to follow the WCAG guidelines. And you may be following those guidelines already, but unless you get input from people with disabilities who process data in a much different way, you're not necessarily going to know what it is they actually want to see. Because people with disabilities are usually a non-targeted user group. It's viewed more through a legal and a compliance lens rather than a we want people with disabilities to be customers lens. And their opinions are frequently omitted from user research. Here's an example of a web page that I worked on a couple of years back. When I originally started working with this, it took 56 tab presses to get to the bottom of the page. And if you were looking at it on responsive mobile on a screen reader, it would have taken Joel 27 swipes to get to the footer. So while it's keyboard accessible and technically passes the WCAG guidelines in that area, it's not usable because it's tedious and it's incredibly time consuming. It took, at that point, a person with a disability about 4 hours to order a week's worth of groceries. So why is accessibility important? Joel and Pia talked about it a little bit, but I'm going to talk about it more from the business side of things. So first of all, the public sector is starting to cut back on purchases of inaccessible software. In the US, the standard is WCAG 2.0, but in Canada and most of the EU, it's the later version, which is 2.1. So if you're a global company, you definitely want to make sure that your software meets 2.1 standards, or you're not going to be able to sell in countries like France and Italy and Sweden. Secondly, we've got an issue with employees suing employers for discrimination. The US is very litigious, and people with disabilities are saying, I can't get a job, I can't get a promotion, I can't get a transfer, because employer, you have chosen inaccessible software that I can't use. A couple of the verdicts have already gone to written decisions, and the fines to the companies and the total cost ended up being close to $1 million. Finding issues earlier makes it much easier and cheaper to fix. From an abstract perspective, accessibility is just another regulatory type of compliance. And from QA, every phase that you march along towards release, with release being at the end of the right-hand side of the scale, you can add a 0 or a times 10 to the amount it's going to cost versus fixing it earlier. So there's a methodology in software development called shift left, because the cheapest and easiest bug is the one that's never introduced in the software to begin with. Reducing time on repetitive tasks is a competitive advantage. So say, for example, you have something that somebody does 50 or 60 times a day. If you can shorten that by 5 seconds, you're looking at saving the person half an hour a week, which is 2 hours a month, which is 24 hours in a year. That's 3 FTE days. And when you look at it from a year-long perspective, you're starting to save your customers some real money. If you make usability improvements like that for people without disabilities, you're going to vastly improve the experience for people with disabilities just inherently. Less friction means it's more likely that they will convert into customers. And believe me, the disability community is fairly tight-knit. Even if if your company doesn't issue a press release saying we've made this experience better for people with disabilities, somebody's going to notice it within a couple of days, and then they're going to post it all over the chat rooms. And then finally, you're able to expand your customer base by including people with disabilities. So those are all the reasons that you really want to make your software accessible. And in order to do that, you need feedback from people with disabilities, either within your organization or outside your organization. So what you're going to be looking at that's different in your fundamental accessibility studies is, first of all, are there any problems with the assistive technology used by people with disabilities or with the product as designed? So not a future state that you want it to be, but how is it working for that user right now? So some of the common forms of assistive technology you're going to see are screen readers, for example, magnification, and keyboards. Those are going to be the most common. Closed captioning is another form of assistive technology, although that you don't need to really do a lot of user experience testing for. And the second thing that you need to ask in your usability studies or UX research with people with disabilities is, are the individuals using this getting enough information that they are basically getting informed consent? Most software now has user agreements. It has things like cookie banners where you agree to the level of your privacy that the software company is guaranteeing. If those agreements aren't accessible to people with disabilities, they haven't provided informed consent, and they're not enforceable against them. We've now convinced you that you want to do user research with people with disabilities. Now we're going to talk about businesses and budgeting and how to get approval for conducting that research. First of all, from my perspective, asking for a business case is a little bit unethical, because you would never say, I'm not going to do user research with people of color, or I'm not going to do user research with women. But for some reason, people think it's okay to exclude people with disabilities from user research. So when I'm asked for a business case, my initial response is usually, you shouldn't need one. It's a civil right. Just do it. That doesn't always work. So when it doesn't work, I do build the business case, and I'm going to tell you in this section how you can do it too. First of all, there are 3 steps. User research with people with disabilities is the right thing to do. It makes business sense, and it's required by law. You can't make your software accessible as you want it to be without input from the disability audience. Start with your business case for inclusive design. There's actually some good studies out there that show for every dollar spent on inclusive design, $4 is returned in company benefits or in increased sales. So that's a no-brainer. Inclusive design includes thinking about accessibility, so you should be able to make the same claim on your business case. It's going to help you get and retain more customers. It prevents having to do rework. And usability work in general is going to improve the experience for everybody. It's going to improve the experience for your non-disabled customers, but it's really going to improve the experience for your disabled customers. And that's through a principle that we call curb cuts. So curb cuts were intended for people like me who are wheelchair users to get from one side of the street to another without requiring assistance. When I was young and in the middle of having all my surgeries, this was about 40 years ago, so it was 10 or 15 years before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, I literally couldn't go anywhere with my mother because there were no accessible parking spaces, and she's 5'6" and 120 pounds soaking wet, and me plus my wheelchair plus my casts were about 200 pounds. She literally couldn't get me from one side of the street to another. So curb cuts were invented to allow that to happen and provide people with disabilities in wheelchairs more independence. But look at who uses them today. Yes, you still see people with wheelchairs in them quite frequently, but what you also see is people pushing strollers using them, Amazon delivery people pushing trolleys full of packages, people dragging luggage, and skateboarders or scooter users. So they're actually the majority of the curb cut users. So a curb cut is something that was intended to help somebody with a disability, but also had a side benefit of helping people without disabilities. That's true with closed captioning. Closed captioning is a classic curb cut. It was intended to help people with hearing loss, but it also helps mothers with noisy children in the background and people multitasking watching videos while they're in gymnasiums. So there's a lot of important uses for captions other than just hearing loss. Making your product more accessible is going to be good for your brand. People are going to see you as a more inclusive organization, both from the customer perspective, and also potential employees are going to see you as being inclusive. The number one concern of millennials these days, by 37% over everything else, is whether or not a company is inclusive. It may make or break whether or not somebody accepts a job at your organization. You're going to be able to extend your market reach because there are over 1 billion users of software that have disabilities, and the spending power of those individuals is $8 trillion. That's outside of the public sector spending power, which is also quite significant. This is just the personal disabled person and disabled person's family's spending power. Making your software more accessible is also going to lower your legal risk. So remember I was talking about employees suing employers? That's definitely an issue, but most of the lawsuits are coming from the general public. There's 5 law firms in particular that are filing more than 80% of the lawsuits in the United States, and they're with repeat plaintiffs, and they're winning about 95% of those cases. There are substantial legal costs if you get a demand letter that proceeds into a lawsuit, probably on the order of a minimum of $500,000 by the time you pay your legal fees, the plaintiff's legal fees, and your outside expert fees. The on-ramp to making a product accessible is really, really long. So for the basic product, it might be 12 months between the time you decide it's going to be accessible and the time it is accessible, because you have to train your staff, you have to do an audit, you have to fix all the bugs, you have to go through this whole change management process to make sure that once you make it accessible, it stays accessible. For a more complicated product, it can actually be an 18 to 24 month timeline. So the sooner you start getting feedback on what the issues are, the faster you're going to be able to get on the accessibility highway. Making your software more accessible is going to help you obtain and keep more employees with disabilities. Right now, 9.5% of people in the 18 to 65 working age range have a disability, but most companies are only employing between 2% and 4%. Some very advanced companies like Apple and Microsoft and Google and Northrop Grumman are employing between 6 and 7%. But those are in incredibly robust organizations that have had disability inclusion efforts for more than a decade at this point. The sooner you get the data, the faster that you can make the changes internally that you need to make in order to recruit and retain more employees with disabilities. Okay, so we covered convincing you to do it. We covered convincing others that you want to do it. Now we're going to talk about the things that you have to change in your regular user research in order to make it more disability inclusive. So first of all, we're going to go through these items one by one, and then I'm going to talk about each in depth. People with disabilities prefer individual interviews over group sessions. They definitely want to bring their own hardware. You're probably going to want access to an assistive technology specialist during your interview in case anything goes wrong. You need to plan for more time to conduct the interview. You need to separate congenital disabilities versus acquired disabilities when you're going through your screening. You're going to need to think about transportation. Many people with disabilities don't drive. And those are in the days when we're doing in-person user research sessions. In the days that we're doing video user research sessions, you need to think about things like Zoom accessibility and making the video and audio experience as equal as possible. And finally, everything has to be accessible. That includes things like the consent forms and the non-disclosure agreements. So it's not just what you're testing has to be accessible, the environment has to be accessible, and the paperwork has to be accessible. You have to think about the fact that you're protecting health information here. People are disclosing very sensitive details about their diagnosis, and you need to make sure that you're planning to keep that data as strictly anonymous as possible. Individual sessions over group sessions. First of all, screen readers are really, really loud. People who are blind who use screen readers typically have at least one and sometimes both ears covered with earbuds, and that makes it difficult for them to interact with others in the room. It also makes it difficult for them to interact with the moderator. Participants can't focus on both what they're doing on the screen reader and what's being said around them. So when you reduce it to a single person and a single interviewer, it works out much better. And then finally, when I mentioned before about private health details, sometimes this involves reliving trauma. I had a user research session once that involved somebody who was blind, who had been blind for 2 years. I asked him why he was blind, thinking that it was going to be retinitis pigmentosa because of his age and his gender. I made that assumption. He actually got shot in a gang drive-by, and that's how he lost his vision. So you have to be careful with that information, and typically people will be less open in a group setting than they will be in an individual setting. Why do people with disabilities want to bring their own hardware? So people with disabilities who use assistive technology have their hardware highly customized. I had one coworker once who had his speech rate on his screen reader on his iPhone set to 325% of normal. I literally couldn't understand what it was saying. It sounded like complete Mickey Mouse to me. But he was able to understand it and use it in a very effective way. When combined with his Braille note taker, which was also connected to his mobile device via Bluetooth, he was able to do a Google query and interpret the results faster than I could typing 100 words a minute. If you hand somebody like that hardware to use, you're immediately creating a barrier. It's going to be something that they're unfamiliar with, and it's going to completely invalidate your results. Because of the assistive technology, it's quite possible that you won't have tried the assistive technology with whatever it is that you're testing previously. So that's where having an AT specialist available for the interview can be really helpful. So you'll want to go to where the people with disabilities congregate to find that kind of person for your interview. So for example, if you're interviewing people who are blind, you would go to Lighthouse for the Blind. They have assistive technology specialists that you can hire for these types of things. If you're doing some type of mobility interview, go to the Centers for Independent Living. If you're doing an interview with people who are deaf or hard of hearing, go to the National Association for the Deaf, and they'll be able to help you with interpreters and anything else that you might need for conducting those research sessions. You're definitely going to need more time. My recommendation is at least 50%. So if the interview would normally take an hour, you want to allocate 90 minutes instead, because you're going to have to set up your software on their device. You're going to have the forms. Best practice would be to get all the forms completed before the session so they don't eat into the time, but it can take a long time for somebody to read really complicated, dense legal text with a screen reader. The operation of the individual is going to be slower. It usually takes people with disabilities about 3 to 5 times as long, even if the software is accessible and usable, to do their transaction. So that takes more time. And then finally, you're going to want to clean things up when you're done, because if you're testing an app, for example, you don't want to leave it on their device when they leave, especially if it's not released. You're going to want to separate congenital disabilities from acquired disabilities. Now that might seem a little bit strange, but the main reasons for that are, first of all, the people with congenital disabilities are going to have a much longer length of experience with that disability than somebody with an acquired disability. They're going to have had time to develop significant amounts of compensatory skills. So, for example, you could take my daughter with hearing loss and somebody with the exact same level of hearing loss who just woke up one day and had an infection and couldn't hear, and they would generate completely different results because my daughter has the length of experience, she's developed the compensatory skills, and the other individual may not have. There's a psychological perspective to it. My daughter doesn't look at hearing as something that she lost. It's something that she never had, where somebody who had perfectly good hearing all their life and then all of a sudden lost some of it overnight, it's I had it and I lost it. So it's a totally different perspective on the nature of the disability itself. Okay, so the final phase. You know how to do it. How do you do it confidently? So first of all, you're going to need to give your personas disabilities. That's a really important thing to do. The way I've done it at VMware is we've made it orthogonal to our regular persona set. So rather than taking each one of our approximately 20 personas and giving them every kind of 21 different disabilities, and that doesn't really address the combination issues, what we've done is we've made them at a right angle. So we'll take our persona, say Shauna or Chris or Tian, and we will say, okay, this is Shauna with migraines. This is Tian with carpal tunnel syndrome. We've chosen 21 disabilities that we think are relevant to our user base. And for each one of these, for our user researchers, we've written up a description of the disability. We've identified the prevalence of the disability and whether or not there's a disproportionate prevalence in our particular user base. VMware users are 80% male. So any disability that is male linked, such as color blindness or hearing loss, is going to occur more frequently in VMware customers, and it's more important for us to test those things. We talk about the impact of the disability and whether or not there's a disproportionate impact anywhere in our software. So for red-green color blindness, anywhere where we have stoplight charts, for example, or histograms, there's going to be disproportionate issues for people who are colorblind because there may be places where we use red and green together, and most people who are colorblind can't distinguish between those two colors. And then finally, we talk about the assistive technology that those individuals might use. A lot of it depends on whether they can get the assistive technology covered as part of a job, because that's usually where they get expensive assistive technology from. Most assistive technology can be acquired for below $500, but some of it, like sip and puff devices for people who are quadriplegic, eye gaze keyboards, and braille note takers, can be in the $2,000 and up range. People with disabilities typically can't afford those themselves, and unfortunately, insurance doesn't cover it. You're going to need to pick an accessible facility. So you're going to have one that's got enough space for people with mobility issues or people who need to walk around to be able to move around freely. You're going to want to have comfortable seating, both for your moderator and for your participant. You're going to want to live stream it so that people outside the facility can ask questions, or some people use two-way mirrors. Two-way mirrors tend to make people with disabilities a little bit uncomfortable, so I definitely recommend the live streaming as a better approach. You're obviously going to want to record the session so that you can go back and review it and make little video snippets that you include in your final report. One thing that you need to know about doing user research with people with disabilities that's very non-standard is that eye tracking and focus technology doesn't work with a lot of groups. For example, people with autism, people with vision loss, people with attention deficit disorder. Your eye tracking data is going to be very erratic, and you might not be able to draw a lot of conclusions from it. Same thing is true for facial expression analysis. The three most accessible video conferencing platforms are MS Teams, Google, and Zoom. MS Teams and Google have captions built in, automatic captions, that are actually fairly good, with two caveats. If either of your individuals are non-native English speakers, or if you're covering a lot of really technical terms or medical terms, the dictionaries on the AI-based captioning aren't good enough yet to do a lot of that transcription accurately. So you're going to want to have a live captioner, which is called CART. It stands for Communication Access Real-Time Transcription. You're going to want to create a customized recruiting script. All you need to do that is to start with your regular recruiting script and include the questions about transportation requirements, what platforms they use, what assistive technology they use, their level of assistive technology experience, the type of disability, the length of disability, and whether it's congenital or acquired. The reason for platforms is that people with disabilities tend to hang on to hardware longer, partly because they're in a socioeconomic strata that's lower than most Americans, and that's a generalization, I realize. They don't like to upgrade. Almost every single person with a long-standing disability has been burned by somebody, by upgrading something, and the entire technology stack that they rely on day in, day out completely craters. You're going to want to ask lots of specific assistive technology questions when you do your interviews. Likert scales are a perfectly acceptable way of doing this. Sometimes people will say that the experience is terrible. They'll give it a 3 out of 10 on the experience, but whether or not they liked it, they'll rate it as a 7. Why? Well, because 98% of the software and web pages these individuals use aren't accessible at all. So if you've made a little effort, it might still be early stages and fairly low on the how good it is scale, but it might completely enchant the user because it's so much better than anything else they've ever seen. So make sure you ask questions about how hard something was, how much they liked it, whether or not there's anything out there that's better, and ask them what's better, what do they prefer using, what is the most accessible solution that competes with your solution, and then make sure that you try to do all the forms in advance so that it doesn't cut into your interview time. Finally, the most important thing about actually conducting the interview is to be open to the question that you didn't know to ask. We always left an open-ended question at one particular employer that I worked for about, well, anything else you'd like to tell us. And the question was about getting food delivered to their homes, which was the main point of the research. The number one finding out of the combination of all the users in the research session were that people who were blind felt left out because they weren't able to play Monopoly. They would get all these Monopoly tickets and they couldn't do anything with them. They wanted to win the $1 million or the fancy house, just like everybody else, have the chance to do that. So we made Monopoly accessible. It was a huge hit. And I don't know anybody who's blind or who has cerebral palsy who's won the $1 million prize yet, but they now have the same chance as everybody else. Thank you for listening to my talk.